Shortly after dawn on the 22nd of January 1879, in the far reaches of the British Empire, a column of redcoats sat down to breakfast. They didn't know it, but just a few miles away, a massive army of 20,000 Zulu warriors lay in wait. By the time the sun set that evening, several thousand men lay dead, the British camp overrun, and the entire garrison destroyed in one of the worst defeats in the army's history. But just what led to that disaster, and how did those men meet their end? In this video, we'll use modern technology, testimony of those who were there, and on-the-ground footage to reconstruct the events of the fight that history remembers as the Battle of Isandlwana. Southern Africa had been a major British interest since the early 1800s, even more so with the discovery of diamonds there in the 1860s, and now the relatively young kingdom of Zululand under King Cetshwayo, with his standing army of 40,000 warriors, also fell under the British Empire's gaze. But Cetshwayo's sovereignty meant very little to Sir Bartle Frere, Britain's High Commissioner in Southern Africa. He wanted a pretext for an invasion of Zululand and subjugation of its people. On the 11th of December 1878, he issued an extremely provocative ultimatum. Cetshwayo must disband his army within 1 month or face invasion. Bartle Frere knew Cetshwayo would never agree, and plans for invasion were already underway. The man chosen to lead that force was Lieutenant General Sir Frederick Thesiger, or Lord Chelmsford. The son of a baron, Eton-educated, and a career soldier, he was by 1879 a lieutenant general and commanded all troops in southern Africa. Chelmsford's plan was to invade Zululand, bring their main army to battle, defeat it, and then disband the Zulu military system, effectively annexing the nation. To do that, he had assembled 3 invasion columns. Number 1, commanded by Colonel Charles Pearson, would advance across the Tukela River here. Number 4, under Colonel Evelyn Wood, would enter Zululand at Utrecht, while the largest, under command of Colonel Glynn, but in reality led by Chelmsford himself, would cross the Buffalo River at a little-known mission station called Rorke's Drift. Supporting him were Colonel Rowland's number 5 column, who would secure the Transvaal border here, and number 2 under this man, Colonel Anthony Durnford, which was to patrol along the Tukela and Buffalo Rivers to secure the Natal border. Durnford was also a career soldier who'd been in the region since 1871, though he was operating under something of a cloud. Late in 1873, he'd been involved in a calamitous skirmish at Bushman's River Pass, in which he'd shown great personal courage, but his command skills had been brought into question. Since then, Durnford's desire was to prove to all that he was a true leader of men. Let's take a look at number 3 column, which by midnight on the 11th of January 1879 was poised on the borders of Zululand to begin the invasion. The backbone of the column was a total of 12 companies, 5 from the 1st Battalion and 8 from the 2nd Battalion of the 24th Regiment of Foot, a little under 1,200 men. Armed with breech-loading Martini Henry rifles, these professional soldiers were highly competent and would form the main fighting component of number 3 column. Their chief support would come from 2,200 men of the locally raised Natal Native Contingent, or NNC. Not being fully trusted by British command, they were given only 1 rifle per 10 men, and that with only 5 rounds, with the remainder carrying the traditional fighting spear and shield. Alongside them were 100 men of the Natal Native Pioneer Corps. Providing long-range firepower were the 170 men and 6 7-pounder mountain guns of N5 Battery, Royal Artillery. Then there's the mounted force, 115 men of the Imperial Mounted Infantry and 234 volunteer auxiliaries, mounted police and locally raised troops. They knew the terrain and were accomplished horsemen, so around 3,900 fighting troops. Also attached were 200 wagons drawn by 4,000 oxen, driven by 400 civilian personnel and accompanied by a number of miscellaneous followers. All told, a column of some 4,800 personnel. When on the morning of the 11th of January, those first troops began their advance, hopes were high, but an immediate problem became evident. That advance was going to be extremely slow. In fact, it took literally the entire day for the column just to reach and cross the Buffalo River. That said, there was action early on, as Chelmsford immediately launched troops of the NNC into the Bachi Valley to drive the relatively few defenders from the area. With the border cleared, Chelmsford's advance towards the Zulu capital at Ulundi could begin. Leaving behind a frustrated company under Lieutenant Bromhead to guard the river crossing at Rorke's Drift, the column lumbered along this track and eventually out of sight. On rutted roads with slow-moving oxen, that force, over the next 8 days, moved only 12 miles. How would Chelmsford ever catch the main Zulu army at this pace? About midday on the 20th of January, the column came within sight of the distinctive rocky hill of Isandlwana. Let's take a look. It's actually, on face value, a pretty good area to encamp, for several reasons. One, Isandlwana itself appears to provide good clear views north, east and south. To the foot of the hill to the east is good flat camping ground. Several wagon tracks cross the area, and there's even a nearby water source in the Manzinyama stream. If there were any concerns, they lay here to the north and east, where beyond this plateau were several dry watercourses known as dongas, each offering an opportunity for concealment out of sight of the sentries at camp. But with intelligent placement of those sentries, the entire region should be free from surprise attacks. Cavalry vedettes on high ground up to 4.5 kilometers from camp during the daytime, and infantry in a closer circle would provide the protective eyes and ears. But at night, those vedettes, too isolated, were brought in, and the infantry too was recalled closer to camp, significantly limiting the protective screen. Relatively content, Chelmsford gave orders for camp to be set up. Lines north to south on the eastern side of Isandlwana, we see that the camps, which consisted predominantly of rows of large bell tents, started with the 2nd and 3rd NNC battalions before reaching the lines of the 2nd Battalion 24th and Colonel Glynn's headquarters. Just here were the N Battery tents and then those of the mounted contingent, whilst here was the camp of the 1st Battalion 24th. Following the wagon path westwards, it passes through an area between Black's or Stony Kopje and Isandlwana, which became known as the Saddle or the Neck, in which were the hospital tents, pioneer encampment and the large wagon park with baggage guard. A quick word about the camp's defence, and it's important. Standard military practice of the time was when encamped to dig entrenchments around the perimeter for defensive purposes, but it was time-consuming and tiring, especially with extremely hard shale underfoot. But there was another option, lagering, circling wagons into a makeshift defensive perimeter. This was well-established practice in the region and was less time-consuming. But with a strong force at his command and fully expecting to move soon, Chelmsford would do neither. With the camp established and the men going about their usual duties, Chelmsford turned his attention to bringing the enemy to battle. He believed, correctly, that by now Ketchwea would have mustered his army and sent them off in defence of their homeland. But where were they? On the 21st of January, Chelmsford sent out a sizable reconnaissance force under a Major Dartnell to scout this area to the southeast. Around 4 PM and then throughout the night, and exactly according to his prediction, he received several reports confirming a large body of Zulus had been spotted moving in these hills. Chelmsford had a dilemma. First, he knew that the Zulu were highly mobile and that his force was not. Second, if he took his entire command to engage the enemy, the chances are they would disappear before he could bring them to battle. And third, if he didn't take his entire force, he needed enough men to fight the Zulu, but also leave enough behind to protect the camp. By 2 AM on the 22nd, he'd reached his decision. He would split his command as follows. Chelmsford would pursue the Zulu at the head of a flying column, consisting of 6 companies of the 2nd 24th, 15 companies of the NNC, 4 of his 6 7-pounder guns, and 3/4 of his mounted troops, around 2,500 men, leaving 5 companies of the 1st 24th, 1 of the 2nd Battalion, 5 companies of NNC, his remaining 2 7-pounders and 1/4 of his mounted detachments, around 1,400 men, to defend Isandlwana. History tells us that this was a defining moment in the campaign, and that's true, but in fairness, given the intelligence he had available at the time, Chelmsford probably made the best choice. That is, of course, providing that the main Zulu army was where he believed it was. To further support Chelmsford, he sent Lieutenant Smith Dorrien in a hair-raising solo night ride back to Rorke's Drift to find Colonel Durnford, with orders to bring his 500 men up to Isandlwana. At 3 AM on the 22nd of January, Chelmsford and his flying column left camp in pursuit of the main Zulu army, leaving Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pillane to take command of the camp's defence. Born in Yorkshire and the son of a clergyman, he'd been commissioned into the British Army in 1855 and had served throughout the Empire ever since. A talented administrator, he'd held numerous staff postings and was by 1879 a lieutenant colonel with the 1st Battalion 24th, the command of which he inherited when his superior, Colonel Glynn, was promoted to lead No. 3 column. Despite 24 years in the British Army, Polaine had never seen large-scale action. Fully expecting to soon receive orders to pack up and follow on, he unsurprisingly did not begin the process of entrenching or lagering. But fate intervened, when at about 7:30 a.m. a report from the Vedette line to the north arrived. A large body of Zulu had been seen moving in and out of the rolling hills to their front. This was concerning news. There shouldn't have been Zulu anywhere near the camp. Before long, Polaine would learn why. The force that Chelmsford had gambled all on pursuing was not the main Zulu army at all, but a smaller force, perhaps acting as a decoy. All the while, the main Zulu impi was only a few miles away and within striking distance of the unsuspecting redcoats encamped at Isandlwana. Polaine quickly ordered the stand to, and to the blare of bugles, men left their half-eaten breakfast and rushed to join their companies east of the tent lines. But by the time they'd assembled, the Zulus seemed to have disappeared again, and Polaine was left guessing as to both their strength and intentions. For an hour, men waited as the heat began to build, but with no further reports, the stand down was called, and the men could return to their now cold breakfasts. Around 10 a.m, Colonel Durnford rode into camp and met Polaine. The two discussed the situation. It's worth noting that Durnford was, as a brevet colonel, Polaine's superior and therefore probably assumed command of the camp. Informing Durnford of the earlier sightings and his uncertainty as to what was out in the hills, Polaine, who had been given orders to act strictly on the defensive, was in favour of keeping his force close to camp. Durnford wasn't, and he decided to immediately send several mounted patrols to investigate. 2 troops of horsemen under Lieutenants Raw and Roberts would head northwards, following this route up onto the Nkutsu or Inyoni Plateau, passing Mkwene Hill before continuing to probe into the unsighted valley beyond. Durnford, with a further 2 troops and his mule-drawn rocket battery, would follow this route before meeting the others, having either driven the enemy from the area or at least effectively scouted the vicinity. At 10:15, Raw and Roberts set off, with Durnford departing 15 minutes later, quickly leaving the rocket battery trailing in his wake. For now, Polaine had little to do but wait, though he was increasingly concerned about those early reports of Zulu to the north, who could potentially outflank the camp, so he sent Captain Kavai's E and Mostyn's F companies to take up position here to keep a sharp lookout. 20 minutes later, Raw and Roberts found themselves in this area and began sighting small groups of Zulu. They continued on, with Raw's troop locking onto a group of Zulu boys driving a small herd of cattle. They raced to catch them as they slipped out of view over the crest of this hill. Arriving seconds later and pulling up sharply, Raw and his men were astonished at what they found. Spread out below them were thousands upon thousands of warriors. He had found the Zulu army. One warrior recalled that very moment.
A small herd of cattle came past out line from our right, being driven by some of our scouts. And just when they were opposite the Umcinjo regiment, a body of mounted men on the hill to the west galloped, evidently trying to cut them off. When several hundred yards off, they perceived the Umcinjo and dismounting, fired a volley and then retired. The Umcinjo at once jumped up and charged. An example which was taken by the Unokenke and Unodwengo on their right and Ingoba Makosi and Umbonambi on their left.
The Battle of Isandlwana was about to begin. But what about that Zulu army? Led by 70-year-old Chingwayo Kamaholi Koza, Quechua's commander-in-chief, it was composed of multiple regiments of warriors grouped by age. The bulk were armed with the traditional cowhide shield and flat-bladed stabbing spear known as an assegai or iklwa in Zulu. There were, though, quite a number of firearms in Zulu hands at the battle. Ranging from obsolete flintlocks to modern breech loaders, the Zulu almost certainly outnumbered their opponents in quantity of firearms. Each regiment had a role to play when fighting in the traditional horns of the buffalo formation. This was a classic double envelopment, with the chest leading the advance in the centre and each horn performing a flanking manoeuvre to surround and cut off the enemy's retreat. What Charlie Raw discovered in the valley was probably the Zulu chest, with 8,000 men of the Umkandampevu and Umbonambi regiments. Some way to their south was the Zulu left horn, made up of the Uve, Ingoma and parts of the Isandlwana, around 5,000 warriors. And here, hitherto unseen, were 3,500 men of the right horn from the Udududu, Isanku and Imbube. Finally, in the loins, forming the reserve, were the Undi Corps, with the Indlondlo, Inlunyengwe, Udloko and the rest of the Isandlwana regiment. Their destiny would lie at Rorke's Drift. Riding hell for leather back down the rise they'd climbed, Raw and his scouts fired off their weapons and doubled back towards the camp. Seeing the commotion ahead, the stand to was again called and men rushed to join their companies. On the right flank, Durnford had already pushed a number of kilometres to the east. By the time he reached Atusi Hill, he was met by the sound of galloping hooves as two vedettes watching on from Conoco Hill had chased him down. Just in time, they informed Durnford that several thousand Zulu were about to appear. Moments later they did, and fearing being cut off, he gave the order to withdraw. To his and his men's credit, he didn't do so without a fight. In fact, as the leading Zulu approached, he was able to commence a fighting withdrawal with his troopers dismounting, firing a volley into the advancing Uve regiment before remounting and retiring, a process they would repeat for several kilometres. Lumbering on behind and unaware of events to their front was the rocket battery. By the time Durnford's force came streaming back to their south, they saw the first of the Left Horn's warriors appearing over the ridge to their front. Hastily setting up, Major Russell called out orders and a single rocket screamed off into the distance. Moments later, the leading Zulu skirmishers 100 yards away loosed off a ragged volley which hit Russell and caused the supporting NNC company to fall apart and flee backwards towards camp. With Russell dead, the rocket battery was overrun by the oncoming Zulu. Up to now, the situation amongst those in camp was still unclear as the advancing chest was blocked from view by this ridge. But further to the north, where Captains Mostyn, Kavai and a section under Lieutenant Dyson was stationed, developments were more worrying. At the extreme range of Martini Henry fire, the 180 men stationed here could do little to stop the thousands of Zulu of the right horn who crossed their front from right to left without engaging the redcoats, before disappearing into this valley, to reappear at a time and place as yet unknown. A short time later, the first sight of the enemy was seen from camp as the entire ridgeline filled with several thousand Zulu warriors. Now there was a very real risk that a good portion of Pulane's available firepower would be cut off here, so he sent his adjutant, Lieutenant Melville, to hurry both companies back to camp. Finally, knowing what he was facing, Pulane set his main battle line. From left to right, arrayed in a single-rank skirmish line in a wide arc from north to east, with perhaps 1.5 metres between each man, first was Captain Reginald Younghusband and the 90 men of C Company. Next were NNC and then mounted troops under Raw and Roberts. Beyond them were Mostyn and Kavai's F and E companies. Facing northeastwards was Captain Porteous's A Company, then the pair of mountain guns, which were quickly coming within range of the advancing chest. South of them, and facing east, was Captain Wardell's H, and then Charles Pope's G Company, which, swollen by all 2nd Battalion details left in camp, numbered perhaps 170 men. Not only were they very extended, but their right flank, more than 1 kilometre from the camp, was vulnerable, with only Lonsdale's mostly spear-armed NNC some distance off. Later, Bradstreet's mounted volunteers took up a position in the Nyongani Donga, extending the right of the line, but the gaps were wide. The most obvious danger at this time lay with Durnford, whose 100 mounted troopers were facing several thousand warriors. By now they were approaching the position occupied by Bradstreet, the Nyongani Donga, a deep dry watercourse which offered good protection from incoming fire. Here Durnford determined to hold. Jabez Molif of the Edendale troop was there. The colonel rode up and down our line continually, encouraging us all. He was very calm and cheerful, talking and even laughing with us. "Fire, my boys! Well done, my boys!" he cried. There were not very many of us, but because of the way in which we were handled by our leader, we were enough to stop the Zulus on that side for a long time. In the main firing line, men watched on as more and more Zulu appeared over the ridge, with the defenders finally realising the tremendous odds they were facing. But, trained as regulars were, they held the line and waited for fire orders. First at 600 yards, a volley rippled out across the plain and a number of Zulu fell, but they kept on coming. Firing faster now, more fell as the men adjusted their iron sights downwards notch by notch. 500, 400, 300 yards. Finally, firing fast and hitting their targets much more frequently, the Zulu chest was checked, and they too took to ground. There was at this stage something of an impasse as the well-controlled British fire kept the Zulu at bay, but by midday, Durnford's position in the Donga was coming under increasing pressure. Some 700 metres southeast of Pope's G Company, the continued high rate of fire was taking its toll. With carbine barrels too hot to touch, stoppages became more common, as did depleted ammunition pouches, which diminished the rate of fire. The result was that the bravest young warriors in the Uwe began to work their way around Durnford's flanks, threatening to cut off his heavily outnumbered command. Away to the north, things were equally concerning. Ever since the right horn had been spotted by Mostin and Cavai moving across their front, they hadn't reappeared, though certainly they were somewhere nearby. Captain Younghusband was no doubt aware that troops had been spotted, but dealing with the right of the Zulu chest to his front, he probably could do little more than instruct his left-hand file to keep a close eye out for movement on his flank. By 12:30 in the Nyugani Donga, Durnford's men, who had started the fight with 50 rounds each, were dangerously low on ammunition, and men were beginning to race back to camp in search for more. Along with mounting casualties, the rate of fire further diminished and the Zulu took heart. Approaching closer to his right, and more worryingly, with men of the Umbonambi regiment now infiltrating the gap between him and the main line, something had to be done. Seeing the danger, Palaine ordered one of his 2 guns to begin firing in Durnford's support, with several shrapnel shells immediately taking effect. It's also likely that Pope's G Company, who may until that point have been unengaged, made a fateful move. At the very least, he turned his force 90 degrees to fire into the warriors filling this gap, but more likely he gave orders to march behind Lonsdale's NNC Company directly to Durnford's aid. He was too late. Just as Pope approached, Durnford's command, exhausted of ammunition and about to be overrun, remounted and withdrew back towards the camp, leaving G Company detached from the main line, isolated and holding back the entire left horn. Seeing the opportunity, several courageous Zulu commanders urged their men into action, and the warriors of the left horn rose up and began a charge on the outnumbered redcoats, driving G Company to a makeshift square which left a significant gap between Pope's right and the camp, which warriors now began to flood into. The entire right flank of the British position had been turned. Now Palaine acted, too late to shorten his line, and the bugle call "Retire" echoed out across the valley. Immediately, the thin red line began withdrawing towards the tents, the result being that the warriors in the chest, no longer under fire, also rose up en masse and began to chase down the withdrawing British. For those in camp who were not yet engaged, it was clear they were in dire trouble. Many, including most of the NNC, would flee towards safety through the saddle, taking the road back to Rorke's Drift. About the same time, the remaining gunners of N5 Battery limbered up their guns and furiously raced for the perceived safety offered beyond the saddle. As the redcoats drew closer to the camp, the pursuing Zulus closed the last few yards at a sprint, with the soldiers forming defensive rally squares as a brutal hand-to-hand fight developed as men withdrew, paused, fired, and withdrew again, surrounded by the enemy. Out on the right, Pope's men adopted similar tactics, and Lonsdale's NNC fell back on camp too. The whole British force was now desperately fighting to keep some semblance of cohesion. But the damage had been done. As the gunners raced for the saddle, passing Durnford stubbornly fighting to their left, and reached the road to Rorke's Drift, they were met by the horrifying sight of thousands of warriors streaming towards them. The right horn had arrived. With the road to Rorke's Drift blocked, the gun teams and any escapees from this point would be forced to run a horrific gauntlet down an area dubbed Fugitives Trail. Given the almost total casualties on the British side from this point on, there's a fair amount of supposition in what follows, but some Zulu accounts, passed on through oral history traditions, recall a few identifiable moments. One is of a Zulu commander who recalled 2 officers with glass in their eyes, charging forwards firing their revolvers until one was shot and the other struck in the chest with an assegai. This very likely refers to the deaths of Charles Pope and Lieutenant Austin of G Company, the only 24th officers who habitually wore glasses. There are witness accounts too from here near the wagon park, where Durnford's dwindling command, in square, was inching its way towards the saddle. but making an easy target for warriors with throwing spears and outdated firearms, and likely with no ammunition of their own, his command was rapidly being destroyed. With accounts stating that the officer with the big moustache and his arm in a sling, almost certainly Durnford, fought bravely amongst his men. It's probable too that not far away at the same time, what was left of Wardell's H Company also edged its way towards the saddle, but surrounded on all sides, they wouldn't make it. For the remainder, CF, E and A companies, as they fell back into the camp under relentless pressure, they were forced to navigate the still standing rows of tents which broke up their formations and provided opportunities for individual warriors, as one man recalled. A red soldier would back into the wall of a tent with his bayonet fixed, as we Zulus would dart around the back of the tent, open the tent with a slash of an assegai, and then stab him through the wall. We knew we'd got him, as the white would then turn scarlet. Across the whole battlefield, chaos descended as Zulu charged in on all sides. H Company Square, having moved several hundred yards, were likely brought to bay just here, about the same time that 100 yards away, Durnford's last stand was coming to an end. Fighting with rifles, knives, fists and teeth, the final few men were wiped out right here. Durnford himself reportedly fought bravely to the end, his body being found in the centre of a small knot of his men. The destruction of Durnford's command was the moment of no return. As the unengaged right horn poured unopposed through the saddle from the west, the fate of every redcoat left in camp was sealed. From the few accounts we have, and what was discovered later on the battlefield, it's likely that the remnants of C, F and E companies managed to form a single square around here, whilst A Company, detached from the rest, formed their own small square around here. About that same time, Lieutenant Melville, possibly on orders, took the Queen's colour of the 24th and with it attempted to ride for safety. He and fellow officer Neville Coghill would lose their lives on the banks of the Buffalo River, just at the point of reaching safety. Both men would posthumously earn the Victoria Cross. For those left in camp, there were no such glorious final moments. Short on ammunition, utterly terrified and with many wounded, the knots of men edged towards the only daylight they could see in the saddle, unaware that the right horn had already closed that route to safety. In short succession, the last men of A Company fell, back to back and surrounded by warriors. Then the largest square, unable to move, engaged in a fight that would see every single man killed. One group, maybe as many as 50 men strong, under Captain Younghusband, was witnessed to have scrambled their way up the face of Isandlwana as high as they could get, with their backs quite literally to the wall. There they stayed for at least some time, holding off all attempts to reach them. It's a powerful scene to imagine. Perched right here, having fired off their final rounds and surrounded on three sides by a sea of warriors, it was clear that there was no escape. Perhaps one or two in those final moments remarked the ominous dimming of the sun as a solar eclipse reached its zenith, giving the Zulu their name for the battle, the Day of the Dead Moon. According to a warrior of the Unokenke, a Zulu regimental commander, seeing that Younghusband's group was doomed, called to his men to pause their attack, allowing the captain, in one last powerful gesture, to walk along the ranks of his men, shaking hands with each before turning back to face their enemy. The warrior veteran recalled, "At last the soldiers gave a shout and charged down upon us. There was an Induna in front of them with a long flashing sword, which he whirled around his neck as he ran. It must have been made of fire. They killed themselves by running down, for we got above and quite surrounded them." The camp at Isandlwana had fallen. But where was the last stand of the 24th? Today it's impossible to be sure, but it's likely that one group of red-coated infantry under Lieutenant Edgar Anstey managed to force a passage through the thousands of warriors swarming the area, and in a hellish fight made it some distance down fugitives' trail. Exhausted, terrified and completely out of ammunition, they followed this route, today marked with the burial cairns of those who fell along the way, making it as far as the banks of the Mansinyama, about 1,500 metres from camp, before eventually being surrounded and cut down right here, with these graves perhaps marking the final, desperate last stand of the 24th Foot. Over the coming hours, in ones, twos and small groups, the few survivors would make it back into Natal, leaving behind 1,300 fallen comrades, most ritually disemboweled, scattered across the battlefield. Amongst them lay perhaps a further 1,000 Zulu warriors, with as many again succumbing to their wounds in the days to come. The Great Zulu victory, and it was that at Isandlwana, spelled the end of Chelmsford's first invasion of Zululand. With no supplies and morale nil, the remnants of No. 3 column had no choice but to withdraw back to Natal. Early the following morning, the column's vanguard reported flames in the pre-dawn light, emanating from the small mission station at a little place called Rorke's Drift. Surely the 150 defenders there had met the same fate as their comrades at Isandlwana, but that's a story for another day. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video and you'd like to support us to make more free content just like this, please take a moment to check out our Patreon and YouTube membership links below. For those wanting to know more detail about the Battle of Isandlwana, we highly recommend Ian Knight's book Zulu Rising, which covers both this and the action at Rorke's Drift in great detail. Finally, a huge thank you to historian Ian Castle, whose expertise was essential in retelling this story. That's all this time. We'll see you again soon.